When a little girl begged her school bus driver to let her stay in the bus overnight, the driver initially thought that the girl was just a young child looking for an adventure. However, after he noticed the girl's jumpy and scared demeanor and saw a bruise peeking out from under her sleeve, he realized that something sinister and evil was going on in the little girl's home. With the girl's safety hanging in the balance, a race against time began as the girl's teacher, the school bus driver, and a determined social worker rushed to save her before it was too late. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Dalton Academy welcomed new students each year, and many of them arrived with excited smiles, skipping steps, and eager chatter. But when Annie stepped through the tall iron gates one chilly morning, there was little brightness in her eyes. She was 9 years old, dressed in a faded pink sweater, and she looked around the school courtyard with hesitation rather than wonder. The crisp wind blew her dark hair around her face, and she pulled the sleeves of her sweater down, as though trying to hide from the world. She nodded politely when a staff member greeted her, but she offered no more than a single syllable in response. While most of Dalton Academy's teachers were used to children having first-day jitters, a few observed something different about Annie. She was not just shy, nor simply overwhelmed by the bustling environment of the school. There was an anxiousness to her movements, a twitch of her shoulders whenever someone approached unexpectedly, the way her eyes darted left and right, as if she were searching for an escape route rather than a new friend. To many, it was barely noticeable, but there were those at Dalton Academy who had a keen eye for such subtleties. Mr. Evans, the physical education teacher, noticed immediately that Annie lingered at the edge of the group of children gathered for the morning warm-ups. He had been at Dalton Academy for several years, and he often prided himself on being able to sense when a child was wrestling with something. He had seen all sorts of kids come through the school. Some were rebellious, others were withdrawn, and a few were downright terrified of the world around them. It was on that first day, as Annie stood in the grass with her hands clasped in front of her, that Mr. Evans felt a tug of concern. He saw how Annie flinched when a soccer ball bounced too close to her feet, how she jerked her head up as if expecting someone to scold her for no good reason. That was the day he resolved to keep a discreet eye on her. In the weeks that followed, Annie's teachers noticed small, puzzling details that didn't quite add up. She was quiet, so quiet, in fact, that she blended in with the background most of the time. Yet there were moments during lunchtime or recess when she displayed a flash of inner determination. Once, another child accidentally shoved her, and Annie nearly lost her footing. For an instant, a spark of what seemed like defiance flashed across her face. Then, as if remembering something, she visibly reined herself in, muttered an apology that should have come from the other child, and hurried away. It looked as though a brave spirit lay inside her, yet she was too fearful or hesitant to let that side of her emerge for more than a fleeting moment. Meanwhile, the school bus driver, an older man named Rick, found himself puzzled by Annie's behavior during the morning and afternoon ride. She always sat in the middle row of the bus, close enough to the front so that she could see him, but never so close that she had to interact with the boisterous children around her. She held her backpack on her lap, hugging it with a kind of tense desperation. Each time the bus bounced over a pothole, she would grimace, as if afraid of attracting attention for reacting too strongly to the jostle. One afternoon, Rick noticed that Annie was one of the last children left on his route. She was supposed to get off at a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the yards were neatly trimmed and the houses stood in polite rows. As the bus pulled up to her stop, he glanced at her in the wide overhead mirror. She hesitated before stepping out. The expression on her face was not simply reluctance to leave. She looked almost terrified, as though something terrible lurked beyond the door. When Rick gave her a friendly wave, she forced a small smile before trudging down the steps. Rick found himself watching her for a moment longer. Usually, kids hopped off the bus quickly, eager to run home and drop their school bags. But Annie walked so slowly, glancing over her shoulder, that it left an uneasy feeling in Rick's chest. Another teacher who kept an eye on Annie was Ms. Keller, a kind-hearted woman who taught language arts. She noticed the bruises on Annie's forearms one day when Annie absent-mindedly pushed up her sleeves. They were faint, in that yellowish stage of healing, but the pattern struck Ms. Keller as odd, like finger marks. Annie swiftly tugged her sleeve back down when she realized Ms. Keller was looking. She offered a small, panicked smile, then ducked her head. That moment replayed in Ms. Keller's mind long after the school day ended. She thought about bringing it up to the principal, but she reasoned that she needed a bit more evidence or some stronger reason to believe that something was truly wrong. Deep down, Ms. Keller suspected that Annie came from a troubled home. However, the Morgans, Carl and Denise, seemed civil enough during the few times they had shown up at parent meetings. They dressed neatly, spoke politely, and always thanked the teachers for their hard work. Yet they never let Annie speak for herself. If a question was directed at Annie, one of the Morgans would answer on her behalf, with a veneer of pleasant authority. The couple rarely allowed Annie more than a few seconds to respond. And Annie herself always went quiet, eyes lowered, hands twisting the hem of her sweater. It was not typical. Ms. Keller had taught for a decade, and she had seen many different types of parents. She felt that something about the Morgans was off. They were too careful, too measured, as if they had rehearsed how to appear. It struck her as a performance, though she had no concrete evidence of that. So, she waited, hoping Annie might feel safe enough one day to confide in someone. It all came to a head one gray, drizzly afternoon in the middle of autumn. The sky was overcast, and a light rain pattered against the bus windows. Rick was making his usual after-school rounds, dropping off children at their stops. Once again, Annie was one of the last students aboard. Rick was about to turn onto her street when he heard a small voice from behind him. Can I sleep here tonight?" Annie asked, her words trembling as though she were on the brink of tears. Rick nearly slammed on the brakes in surprise, but he managed to maintain control. He glanced into the overhead mirror and saw Annie sitting there, her little hands balled into fists around the straps of her backpack, her eyes wide with fear and longing. For a second, Rick thought she was joking, perhaps playing some sort of imaginative game. Then he remembered her anxious demeanor, the bruises, and the way she always seemed reluctant to step off the bus. Something inside him twisted at the sight of her hunched shoulders and trembling lower lip. "Why would you want to sleep in a bus, kiddo?" Rick asked, doing his best to keep his tone light but gentle. He hoped to coax out some explanation, or at least gauge how serious she was. "You know the seats aren't exactly comfy." Annie hesitated. He could see her wrestling with herself. Her small face crumpled, and she looked down at her feet. I don't want to go home," she finally whispered. That single sentence was enough to send alarm bells ringing in Rick's mind. He pulled the bus to a stop along the curb and turned around in his seat. Carefully, he made his way down the aisle toward her, his posture as unthreatening as possible. Annie looked up, and he noticed the shadow of a bruise just below her sleeve. He also noticed how she shrank back, as though expecting to be reprimanded for speaking out of turn. Rick knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Annie," he said softly, "what's going on? You can trust me, all right." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't, Dale." She stopped, her breath hitching. Something about her reaction made Rick's stomach sink. He had heard rumors, or rather half-formed concerns, from some of the teachers about Annie's situation. But hearing her quiet plea, seeing the fear etched across her features, made everything feel much more urgent and real. Without further ado, Rick decided he needed to contact the school. Usually, he would have escorted Annie home, but now he had the distinct conviction that bringing her to the Morgans' doorstep would be the wrong thing to do. He picked up his cell phone and called Ms. Keller, who he knew had a close eye on Annie's well-being. He explained the situation in a hushed tone. Ms. Keller agreed to meet them back at the school immediately. Once Rick ended the call, he gently told Annie, We're going back to Dalton Academy for a bit, all right? Miss Keller and Mr. Evans want to make sure you're okay." He paused, then forced a small smile to reassure her. "We'll figure this out." Annie nodded, clinging to her backpack as though it contained the only safety she knew. The ride back to the school was quiet. The bus rattled over potholes, the windshield wipers squeaked across the glass, and the smell of damp asphalt drifted in from the open window at Rick's side. Annie sat perched on the edge of her seat, not even leaning back. She watched Rick with a mix of hope and fear. That expression on her face tore at Rick's heart. He had driven school buses for many years, and never before had he encountered a child so desperate to avoid going home. When they arrived at the school, Miss Keller and Mr. Evans were already waiting by the administration building. They were huddled beneath the overhang, umbrellas in hand, scanning the nearly empty parking lot. As soon as the bus parked, Miss Keller stepped inside, closed her umbrella, and hurried to Annie. Mr. Evans stood just outside the bus doors, peering up the aisle with concern etched into his features. "Annie," Miss Keller said gently, reaching out to touch her shoulder. "We're here for you, okay? Whatever you're afraid of, we can help." The little girl didn't speak. She only stared at Miss Keller, tears still threatening to fall. Then she let Miss Keller guide her off the bus and into the school building. The halls were dim and almost deserted. Custodians were cleaning up after the day's classes, and the faint smell of disinfectant lingered in the air. Doors were shut, lockers stood silent. It felt eerie, being in a place so usually brimming with life, but now empty. Annie's footsteps squeaked on the tiled floor as she followed Miss Keller, and Mr. Evans and Rick trailed behind, their expressions grim. They guided Annie to the principal's office, which was lit by a single lamp on the secretary's desk. The principal, Mr. Gray, had been briefed by Miss Keller over the phone. He greeted Annie kindly, then suggested they bring in Miss Taylor, the school's social worker who often assisted in cases like this. Miss Taylor soon arrived, out of breath from the anxious phone call she had received, her eyes reflecting both worry and fierce determination. Miss Taylor bent down, meeting Annie's eyes, and introduced herself. "I'm here to help you," she said. "No matter what's going on, I'm going to make sure you're safe." Annie looked away, her lip trembling. "I can't go home," she murmured. "Please, don't make me go back." It was a plea more heartrending than Miss Taylor could bear without reacting. She glanced at the adults gathered in the small office. Rick, Mr. Evans, Miss Keller, and the principal. They all exchanged grave looks. They had suspected something was off for a while. Now, this was their confirmation. Miss Taylor gently asked Annie a few questions. Did somebody hurt her? Was there something happening at home that frightened her? Annie answered only with downcast eyes and tremulous refusals to speak further. Still, Miss Taylor's trained eye noted the bruises under Annie's sweater, the flinches and the telling tear stains on the girl's cheeks. She felt her heart twist at the sight. She had seen these signs too many times before. Children in abusive homes often showed a particular brand of terror, one that no child should ever know. After a few tentative questions, Miss Taylor managed to glean enough to believe it was urgent to speak with Annie's foster parents, Carl and Denise Morgan. Miss Taylor knew the Morgans had a reputation for politeness, for strict adherence to punctuality and schedules, and for presenting themselves as a model couple. But there was something about them that gave Miss Taylor pause. She had never been entirely comfortable around them. Now, the worry in her chest magnified tenfold. She resolved to act quickly. Sometimes, the difference between safety and danger lay in hours or even minutes. Miss Taylor, Mr. Gray, and Rick reassured Annie that she would not be going home that night. Miss Taylor would arrange a temporary stay at a local children's shelter if immediate placement with a trustworthy caretaker was not possible. Annie seemed relieved, but the tension in her eyes never fully lifted. She kept glancing around, as though worried someone would burst through the doors at any moment, demanding she leave with them. With the child placed under the school's protective watch for the evening, Miss Taylor paid a visit to the Morgans' house early that night. The place was a tidy, two-story home in a well-kept neighborhood. The porch light was on, and potted plants graced the steps, giving the semblance of a warm domestic environment. Denise Morgan answered the door, looking mildly surprised but smiling politely. Carl appeared behind her, equally calm and poised. They invited Miss Taylor into the living room, where she explained the concerns regarding Annie's well-being without giving too many details. She needed to approach the conversation carefully, without tipping them off too much. The Morgans responded with controlled worry, asking if Annie was safe. They claimed to be baffled by her behavior, implying that she must be having trouble adjusting to the school environment. It all seemed plausible enough, but Miss Taylor noticed the subtle tension in the couple's body language. Their smiles were too fixed, and they answered her questions in smooth, well-practiced tones, as though they were used to deflecting suspicion. Whenever Miss Taylor pressed a bit deeper, Carl's jaw twitched. Denise's eyes flickered with annoyance. None of it was overt, but Miss Taylor's professional instincts were on high alert. She took her leave after about half an hour, with a promise to follow up soon. As she stepped out onto the porch, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Annie's words echoed in her ears. "I can't go home." Miss Taylor had witnessed enough domestic abuse cases to recognize that children rarely pleaded to stay away unless they had a genuine reason for terror. Back at the school, Annie was curled up on a small cot in the nurse's office, dozing fitfully under the watch of a staff member who had volunteered to stay late. Ms. Keller checked in on her, lingering by the doorway. In the dim light, she saw the faint lines of worry creasing Annie's brow, even in sleep. Ms. Keller felt an ache in her chest. She vowed then that she would not let Annie slip through the cracks of the system, as so many other children had. Mr. Evans, too, was deeply affected by the situation. He had known children who went through hardships, but seeing Annie so distraught, so fearful, made him remember a time in his own past when he had felt powerless. He was determined that Annie would not face this alone. Early the next morning, just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, Miss Taylor returned to the school. She had initiated a child welfare check overnight, and now there were official procedures to follow. Annie stirred awake, looking even more frightened at the sight of Miss Taylor's solemn expression. Miss Taylor gently explained that she had to ask some important questions. Annie listened with wide eyes, her small fingers gripping a thin blanket the nurse had lent her. "If you don't feel safe at home," Miss Taylor said quietly, "you have to tell me. Did someone hurt you?" Annie cast her eyes down. She shook her head in denial, but her body language told a different story. Miss Taylor knew that many abused children feared speaking the truth, afraid of retaliation or doubting whether anyone would truly protect them. She decided not to press Annie too hard at that moment. Instead, she promised Annie that she would make sure the girl stayed somewhere secure for the time being. Soon, word spread among the faculty that Annie was staying at a shelter until Child Protective Services, CPS, could investigate thoroughly. The Morgans maintained that Annie had behavioral issues stemming from her previous foster placements, and they continued to insist that she would eventually open up to them. They expressed a desire to have her back at their home as soon as possible, claiming they missed her. Yet Ms. Keller and Mr. Evans both felt uneasy about the prospect of Annie returning to the Morgans. In the days that followed, there were more bruises that came to light, old ones that were healing, and a few fresh ones that had not been there before Annie left the Morgans' care. The shelter staff documented everything. The more evidence they gathered, the more it became clear that there was genuine abuse at play, not just an overactive imagination or a troubled child fabricating stories. Annie, however, still found it difficult to speak openly about what had happened. Throughout this process, Ms. Keller, Mr. Evans, and Rick visited Annie at the shelter whenever they could, bringing small gifts like coloring books or soft plush toys. They did not want to overwhelm her, but they wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Each time they visited, they saw a flicker of relief on her face. She would sit with them, quiet but willing to let them stay close. Occasionally, she would even muster a small, shy smile. There was a delicate trust forming there, one that was easily shattered if the system failed her. Then, after some wrangling with bureaucracy, CPS decided that Annie could not remain in the Morgans' home while the investigation proceeded. They officially removed Annie from Carl and Denise Morgan's foster care. The Morgans expressed outrage and disappointment, vocally decrying how they were being slandered by false accusations. They began to paint Annie as a confused, emotionally disturbed child who was lashing out, twisting facts. Their polite facade slipped now and then, revealing flashes of anger and resentment, but they remained careful whenever official channels were involved. With Annie's removal came a new problem. There was nowhere else for her to go, not permanently at least. The shelter was meant to be a temporary solution. Annie, overwhelmed by the thought of being shuffled around to yet another unfamiliar home, grew more anxious by the day. Despite the staff's best efforts to make her comfortable, she became quieter, more prone to nightmares. The constant fear of the unknown wore her down. Late one evening, about a week into her stay at the shelter, Annie vanished. The staff discovered her bed empty during a routine check. Panic spread through the facility. They searched the building, the surrounding streets, but she was nowhere to be found. They alerted Ms. Taylor, who, in turn, contacted the authorities. Everyone feared the worst, that she had attempted to run back to the Morgans, or that someone had taken her. But after calling Ms. Keller, Mr. Evans, and Rick, no one had heard from her. Mr. Evans decided to drive around the neighborhood, calling out Annie's name through the open window of his car. He remembered the stories of children who ran away from foster care, often ending up on the street. His chest tightened at the thought of Annie out there alone, cold and scared, especially in the uncertain weather that threatened more rain. He checked bus stops, parks, any place a frightened child might hide. After several tense hours, he nearly gave up. It was well past midnight, and the streetlights lit up empty sidewalks in a pale, yellow glow. Then, as he turned a corner near a dimly lit underpass, his headlights caught a small figure huddled against the side of a building. He pulled over and jumped out. Heart pounding, he recognized Annie, curled up in her sweater, her cheeks streaked with tears and grime. "Annie," he called gently, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, panicked at first, but then relief flickered across her face. She tried to stand, wincing from the cold, and Mr. Evans rushed over to help her. "Please don't make me go to another place," she whispered, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "I can't do it anymore." A surge of protectiveness welled inside Mr. Evans. He put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm not going to let you be alone, okay? Come on, let's get you somewhere safe." He guided her to his car, where he offered her a warm blanket from the back seat. She sank into the passenger seat, hugging the blanket as though it were a lifeline. Mr. Evans hesitated. Protocol dictated that he should take her back to the shelter or call Miss Taylor immediately. But the desperation in Annie's eyes stopped him. He pulled out his phone and called Miss Taylor. "I found her," he said, voice thick with relief. "She's safe. But she's terrified of going back to the shelter. She's been through so much already." Miss Taylor heard the urgency in his tone. "Bring her in. We'll make sure she's calm and warm. We'll figure this out." Mr. Evans clenched the phone. He glanced at Annie, who was looking at him with pleading eyes. Would it be possible for me to foster her?" he asked, surprising even himself with the directness of the suggestion. "At least for now, until the case is settled." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Miss Taylor sounded cautious but open to the idea. "You'd have to go through an expedited process, background checks, home evaluations. But if you're serious, I can push to get the wheels in motion. Annie needs a stable environment." That was how Mr. Evans set down the phone, feeling both determined and a bit overwhelmed. He met Annie's eyes. "Listen," he said gently, "I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure you have a safe place to stay. You trust me, right?" Annie bit her lip, nodding slowly. "I do," she whispered. Her voice was hesitant, but her gaze held a glimmer of hope. Mr. Evans drove her to a safe location first, meeting with Ms. Taylor and a sympathetic official from Child Services who had come out in the dead of night. Miss Taylor quickly arranged for Annie to stay temporarily under Mr. Evans's watch while the expedited foster application was processed. Over the next few days, Mr. Evans's home was inspected, and he was interviewed extensively. He had to prove he had the means, the stability, and the willingness to care for a child. He passed all the checks with flying colors, receiving strong endorsements from Ms. Keller and Miss Taylor. When Annie first arrived at Mr. Evans's small suburban house, she seemed timid. She hovered in the doorway, as though bracing herself for some sort of punishment or harsh rule. But Mr. Evans gently showed her around, indicating where she could place her backpack, which room would be hers, and how she could decorate it if she wanted. He even set out a small plate of cookies and a glass of milk in the kitchen, an offering of normalcy that he hoped might soothe her. "It's okay," he told her. "This is your home for now. You can rest here. No one will hurt you." Annie tried to speak, but emotion caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, blinking back tears. That night, she slept fitfully, but at least she knew there was someone in the next room who cared. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against the Morgans were ramping up. Child Protective Services had compiled a significant amount of evidence pointing to abuse. The bruises had been photographed, statements had been taken from teachers. Yet the Morgans vehemently denied all allegations. They hired an aggressive lawyer who suggested that Annie was prone to self-harm or that she had been injured in various accidents. They questioned the credibility of a child who had been moved from one foster placement to another, implying that Annie's past experiences made her unreliable or unstable. The courtroom drama intensified. Mr. Evans found himself taking the stand, testifying that Annie had practically begged not to be taken back to the Morgans, that she displayed significant fear at the mention of their names. Ms. Keller described the bruises she had seen, the way Annie cowered whenever anyone tried to touch her shoulders or arms. Rick told the story of how Annie had pleaded to stay in the bus overnight, an event that still shook him whenever he thought about it. But for all the testimonies, the Morgans' lawyer was skilled at sowing doubt. He insinuated that Dalton Academy staff had overreacted due to personal biases, that they had misinterpreted a shy, introverted child's behavior. The Morgans appeared calm and collected in court, dressed in conservative suits, speaking in gentle tones. Denise dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief at times, portraying the image of a heartbroken caregiver. Carl nodded along sympathetically, claiming that he and his wife had only ever wanted to offer Annie a loving home. Annie sat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked smaller than ever, dwarfed by the seriousness of the court proceedings. Each time the judge glanced at her, she sank a bit deeper into her chair. When the time came for her to speak, Ms. Taylor and even Mr. Evans felt their hearts pounding. They knew her testimony could tip the scales decisively. But Annie froze. She stared at the lawyers, at the Morgans, and at the judge, fear etched into every line of her face. "Annie," the lawyer representing the county began gently, "can you tell us what happened at the Morgans' house? It's okay. You're safe here. Just speak freely." Annie's lips parted, but no words came out. She shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. Finally, she managed a tiny, trembling voice, I can't." The judge, seeing her distress, allowed her to step down. Her inability to speak was a blow to the case. The Morgans' lawyer stood, shaking his head in feigned sympathy, and made a plea to dismiss some of the charges. For a moment it seemed as though the Morgans might slip away from serious consequences, or at least prolong the legal battle enough to regain some custody rights or further complicate the situation. Mr. Evans took Annie home that night, feeling a heaviness in his chest. He assured her that no one blamed her, that she had done nothing wrong by freezing up. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, her voice filled with guilt. I just saw them, and I remembered everything they did, and I felt so scared. I wanted to run and hide. I couldn't talk." "It's all right," Mr. Evans replied, trying to sound soothing, though inside he was raging at the system that put such a burden on a child. "You're going to get through this. We're all here for you." Days turned into weeks as the legal battle continued. The tension at Dalton Academy was palpable. Teachers whispered in hallways about whether the Morgans might actually get Annie back. Some staff worried that the Morgans would retaliate against the school for supporting the child abuse allegations. Through it all, Annie grew more withdrawn, living in Mr. Evans's home but carrying the weight of fear on her small shoulders. She cared for no grand luxuries, only for the knowledge that someone was in her corner. The turning point came during the next courtroom session. Annie was present, seated beside Miss Taylor, who was providing emotional support. The Morgans' lawyer repeated his claims that Annie's bruises could be attributed to accidents, that her mental state was fragile due to multiple foster placements before the Morgans. He even implied that Mr. Evans might be coaching Annie to say certain things in order to keep her away from the Morgans. It was a scathing accusation, but one with no proof. Annie seemed to stiffen, her little hands curled into fists in her lap. Her gaze flickered to Miss Taylor, then to Mr. Evans, who sat in the row behind her. Something in her expression changed, like a spark of courage igniting. She stood up, surprising everyone. Her voice quivered, but it rang out clearly enough to silence the courtroom. "They hurt me," she said, pointing her trembling finger toward Carl and Denise Morgan. They said if I ever told, they'd make me regret it. But they hurt me. All the time." A hush fell over the room. Annie began sobbing, but she didn't sit down. She kept her arm raised, pointing accusingly at the Morgans. Carl's composure cracked for a split second. A dark look flashed across his face before he schooled his features again. Denise's eyes widened, and she glanced at her husband as though searching for a cue on how to react. The county's lawyer approached Annie gently, asking if she could elaborate. Through choked sobs, Annie described how the Morgans would shove her, slap her arms when she didn't follow their orders, how they threatened her with worse punishments if she ever spoke out. She admitted she had been too terrified to say anything sooner. The courtroom reaction was immediate. The judge called for order as gasps rippled through those watching. Miss Taylor rushed to Annie's side, placing a comforting arm around the trembling girl. The Morgans' lawyer sputtered, trying to regain control, but the damage was done. Annie's raw testimony carried a weight that all the teacher's statements and photographs could not fully convey. As the proceedings ended that day, the Morgans were taken into custody. There was enough evidence for charges of child abuse to be filed, bolstered by Annie's direct accusation. The relief that washed over Mr. Evans, Ms. Taylor, Ms. Keller, Rick, and everyone who had fought for Annie was almost overwhelming. Annie was safe from the immediate threat of being returned to the Morgans. Yet even with the Morgans behind bars for the time being, a nagging worry remained. They were not the type to give up easily. And sure enough, about 2.5 weeks after the hearing, something horrifying happened, something that would shake Annie to her core and leave Mr. Evans fearing for her life. It was a quiet, ordinary evening at Mr. Evans's house. Annie was in her room, drawing a picture with colored pencils that Mr. Evans had given her, while he was in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner. The soothing scents of tomato sauce and herbs wafted through the house. The last light of day filtered through the windows, and a gentle hush had fallen over the neighborhood. Everything seemed calm. Suddenly, a noise came from the back door, a metallic scrape that made Mr. Evans freeze. He turned off the stove and called out, "Annie, is that you?" But Annie's door was still closed at the end of the hallway. A prickle of alarm ran down his spine. He went to investigate, heart pounding. The back door creaked open, and Carl Morgan loomed there, his expression dark and determined. Behind him, Denise's face was pale but hardened with a grim sense of purpose. Before Mr. Evans could react, Carl and Denise forced their way in. Carl jammed a knee into Mr. Evans's side, knocking the wind out of him. Denise quickly scanned the house, presumably looking for Annie. Mr. Evans tried to shout, but Carl clamped a hand over his mouth, pushing him against the wall. Fear raced through Mr. Evans's mind as he realized the Morgans must have been released on bail, or they had manipulated someone to secure a temporary release. He wasn't sure how. Either way, they were here, in his home, reeking of desperation and fury. "Where is she?" Carl growled, his teeth clenched. Mr. Evans struggled against the man's grip. Carl was taller and stronger, and Mr. Evans felt a jolt of panic at the realization that he might not be able to overpower him. Denise disappeared down the hallway, presumably heading for Annie's room. In a rush of adrenaline, Mr. Evans managed to twist free for a moment and shout, "Annie, run!" His shout echoed through the house. But Denise had already reached Annie's door. She burst inside to find the terrified girl cowering in a corner, hugging a small plush rabbit Miss Keller had given her. Denise grabbed Annie roughly by the arm. Annie whimpered, struggling to break free, but Denise dragged her into the hallway. Mr. Evans tried to lunge forward to help Annie, but Carl caught him again, pinning him to the ground. The small living room lamp flickered, casting ominous shadows. The entire scene was a swirl of panic, fear, and violent determination. Before Mr. Evans could so much as shout again, Carl pressed a cloth to his face, some sort of rag that smelled chemical and sharp. Mr. Evans's vision blurred. Annie's cries rang in his ears as he slipped into unconsciousness. When Mr. Evans came to, the house was eerily silent. A throbbing pain in his head made it difficult to focus. He lay crumpled on the kitchen floor, the door still open to the cool night air. Annie was gone. The Morgans had taken her. Nausea roiled in his stomach as he staggered to his feet. He lunged for his phone, which was lying on the countertop. With trembling hands, he dialed Miss Taylor's number. She picked up, alarmed at his panicked voice. "They took her," Mr. Evans managed, swallowing hard. "Carl and Denise, they broke in. They—" "Annie!" Miss Taylor gasped, her voice urgent. "Stay where you are. Call the authorities right now. I'm on my way." The next hour was a blur of police sirens, frantic calls, and neighbors gathering on Mr. Evans's lawn. The authorities confirmed that Carl and Denise had disappeared with Annie, likely heading out of state. An Amber Alert was issued, and Ms. Taylor contacted federal authorities, given the seriousness of the kidnapping. Mr. Evans felt a cold dread grip his heart. Annie was in the hands of the very people who had tormented her, who had threatened to make her regret speaking out. For 4 harrowing days, there was no word from the Morgans. Police combed the roads, checking motels, following up on potential sightings. The staff at Dalton Academy was devastated, with Ms. Keller pacing the halls, tears in her eyes, and Rick beating himself up with guilt, wishing he had done more to protect Annie. Every phone call made Mr. Evans jump, every rumor of a sighting sending his heart racing. He hardly ate, hardly slept, consumed by worry. Finally, on the 4th day, there was a breakthrough. The FBI received a tip from a motel clerk who recognized the Morgans. The clerk reported seeing a frightened child in their car. Authorities converged on a small motel in a neighboring state. Mr. Evans paced anxiously at home, waiting for word. The minutes stretched like hours. Ms. Taylor stayed in contact with the FBI team, who informed her that they had the place surrounded. In the end, the rescue was sudden and dramatic. Carl tried to flee with Annie when he realized the motel was surrounded. He dragged her outside, threatening harm if anyone approached. But an FBI agent managed to tackle him from behind, knocking him off balance with a swift, precise maneuver. Denise shrieked, trying to grab Annie, but another agent restrained her. Annie stumbled, fear etched on her face, but as soon as she realized the ordeal was over, she collapsed into sobs. The agents assured her she was safe now. Carl and Denise Morgan were taken into custody, this time with no chance of immediate bail. The call Mr. Evans received was short but filled with relief. Annie was safe. She had bruises and scratches from the forced captivity, but she was alive. The sense of gratitude and overwhelming emotion that Mr. Evans felt at hearing those words was indescribable. He rushed to see her as soon as the authorities cleared it. Annie was sitting in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, while paramedics checked her over. When she saw Mr. Evans, she flung her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. "I was so scared," she breathed. I thought." Mr. Evans hugged her tightly, tears in his own eyes. "It's okay. I'm here. They won't hurt you again, Annie." With Carl and Denise swiftly imprisoned, the immediate danger was gone. Annie was brought back to Mr. Evans's home, where she gazed around as though seeing it for the first time. Trauma clung to her, and the nights that followed were filled with nightmares and tears. But therapy sessions started soon after, arranged by Miss Taylor. The unwavering support of her teachers, along with Mr. Evans's gentle care, helped her begin the long, slow process of healing. The final blow to the Morgans case came when new evidence emerged. They had forged documents related to Annie's previous medical records, trying to hide any signs of abuse. They were charged with kidnapping, child abuse, and a slew of other offenses. The prison sentences that awaited them were lengthy, ensuring they would not be a threat to Annie or any other child for the foreseeable future. For Annie, though, the fear did not disappear overnight. She remained jumpy for weeks, sometimes startling at unexpected sounds or shrinking away if someone moved too quickly near her. But each day she found small moments of comfort in Mr. Evans's home, such as reading a favorite picture book on the couch, sipping hot cocoa in the early morning light, or receiving gentle reassurances from Ms. Keller when she visited. Under the guidance of a caring therapist, Annie learned that she had the right to feel safe, that she was allowed to express her fears without judgment. She was encouraged to paint or draw her feelings, and she often reached for bright crayons, creating pictures of flowers, sunshine, or a small girl with a big smile. Over time, she began to speak more openly about her past experiences, though the memories still made her tremble. Throughout the ordeal, Mr. Evans had become more than just a temporary guardian. He was the safe harbor Annie had long searched for. He offered emotional stability, created a routine for Annie's days, and championed her in every meeting with social workers or counselors. Miss Taylor and Ms. Keller observed the bond between them with quiet smiles. It was clear that Annie viewed Mr. Evans as her family now. It came as no surprise to them, then, when Mr. Evans decided to officially adopt Annie. He navigated the legal system once again, signing forms, undergoing evaluations. Though the process was more thorough than a standard guardianship arrangement, none of the steps felt burdensome to him. Each form signed was a promise. Each interview was a step closer to giving Annie the permanent stability she deserved. The adoption day arrived without pomp or pageantry, but it was monumental in its meaning. Annie stood beside Mr. Evans in a modest courthouse, her hands twisting a small ribbon Miss Keller had given her for good luck. The judge reviewed the paperwork, nodded in satisfaction, and then announced that Annie was now legally Mr. Evans's daughter. Annie's eyes welled with tears, and she clutched Mr. Evans's hand so tightly he could feel her small fingers trembling. After they left the courthouse, Miss Keller and Miss Taylor joined them for a quiet celebration. They stopped by a local ice cream shop, where Annie chose a flavor she had never tried before, caramel swirl. The moment she took her first bite, she broke into a genuine smile, a gesture that warmed the hearts of everyone around her. There, in that small booth, with sticky ice cream dripping off cones, they toasted to new beginnings. Annie was still the same little girl who had once begged to stay overnight on a school bus because home was not safe. But she was also different now, allowed to smile without fear, to laugh without glancing over her shoulder. She still had nightmares, still carried scars both seen and unseen, but for the first time in her young life, she felt that tomorrow might hold something hopeful. Mr. Evans walked her to his car after the ice cream celebration, the late afternoon sun shimmering across the windshield. He opened the door for Annie, who settled into the passenger seat, gently placing the plush rabbit Miss Keller had given her on her lap. As they buckled up, Mr. Evans glanced over at her. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Annie pondered the question for a moment, fiddling with the plush rabbit's ears. "I feel safe," she said at last. Mr. Evans smiled, his eyes reflecting both relief and pride. "That's all I ever wanted," he replied. They drove home in comfortable silence, no longer haunted by the specter of the Morgans. Annie gazed out the window, watching the houses pass by, each yard bathed in warm evening light. She thought about how far she had come, from the terrified girl who hid bruises, to the child who had stood up in court to speak the truth, to the newly adopted daughter of a man who saw her for who she was and still wanted her. The roads ahead were uncertain, but Annie knew she would not travel them alone. Inside Mr. Evans's house, everything was as they had left it, cozy, familiar, with the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Annie set down her backpack by the couch. She looked around and exhaled a soft breath, the corners of her mouth turning up in a hesitant smile. "It's home," she whispered to herself. Mr. Evans overheard and gave a gentle nod. "Yes, it is." In that moment it felt like the final puzzle piece had fallen into place. Annie might still have to work through her trauma, might still wake up from nightmares needing reassurance, but she no longer had to face any of that alone. In Mr. Evans's home, she had found acceptance, love, and understanding. She was not just a foster child anymore. She was a daughter, a part of a family. And for a little girl who once begged to stay on a bus overnight, that made all the difference in the world. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.